The morning of March 6, 1945, arrives cold and gray over the ruins of Cologne. Corporal Clarence Smoyer sits in the gunner's seat of a tank unlike any he had commanded before. The machine beneath him weighs 46 tons, 8 tons heavier than the Sherman he had nursed through France. Its 90mm gun protrudes from a turret thick enough, they told him, to stop an 88. They christened her Eagle 7. Outside, through the periscope, the Gothic spires of Cologne Cathedral rise impossibly intact above a city reduced to rubble. Smoyer has been a tanker since Normandy. He knows the metallic taste of fear that floods your mouth when you hear the distinctive crack of a German tank gun. He knows what happens when an 88mm shell punches through Sherman armor, the way it ricochets inside the hull, the smell of burning flesh that follows, the screams that stop too quickly or last too long. He has seen 25 Shermans from his battalion alone knocked out since June. The crews who survived called them Ronsons, after the cigarette lighters, because they lit on fire so reliably. The Germans had a different name, Tommy Cookers. But this tank, this M26 Pershing, was supposed to change everything. The question hanging in the cold German air that morning, the question that had haunted American tank crews since the hedgerows of Normandy, was whether it actually would. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what the Pershing meant to arrive at Cologne in early 1945, you must first understand the systematic terror that German armor had inflicted on American tank crews for the previous 9 months. The war in Western Europe had revealed a profound and deadly gap between American and German tank technology, a gap measured not in inches of armor or calibers of guns but in lives. When the first American tanks rolled off the landing craft at Normandy in June 1944, they arrived equipped with the M4 Sherman medium tank. The Sherman was a reliable machine, easy to maintain, mechanically sound, produced in numbers that overwhelmed German industry. But it was designed for a different kind of war. Its 75mm gun could dispatch the Panzer Mark IV tanks that formed the backbone of German armored divisions in North Africa and Italy. Against the latest German designs, it was catastrophically outmatched. The fundamental problem was simple physics. The Sherman's frontal armor measured 2 inches thick, sloped at 56 degrees. This could stop small arms fire, machine gun rounds and shells from lighter German guns. But the German Panther medium tank mounted an 88mm gun that could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The Tiger I heavy tank, with its 88mm KWK-36 gun, could do the same. And the King Tiger, the Panzer Kampfwagen Tiger II, officially designated the Tiger II but known to Allied soldiers as the Royal Tiger or King Tiger, mounted an even more powerful weapon, the 88mm KWK-43 gun, with a barrel 71 calibers long. This weapon could penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor at 3,000 yards. Think about that distance. Picture 10 football fields laid end to end. A German King Tiger gunner could kill an American Sherman before the American crew even knew the German tank was there. The Sherman's own 75mm gun faced the opposite problem. To penetrate the frontal armor of a Panther, a Sherman had to close to within 300 yards. To penetrate a Tiger I frontally, the range dropped to 100 yards, close enough to read the tactical numbers painted on the enemy turret. And the King Tiger's frontal armor? The Sherman's standard 75mm armor-piercing round simply could not penetrate it at any range from any frontal angle. This created a grotesque arithmetic of death. For every German tank destroyed in France in the summer of 1944, American armored units lost 4 tanks. In some engagements the ratio climbed to 8 or even 10 to 1. During Operation Cobra, the breakout from the Normandy hedgerows, American tank losses peaked at 17 Shermans destroyed for every German tank knocked out. The men inside those tanks knew these numbers. They whispered them in the motor parks at night, calculated them in their heads during the long approach to combat. They knew that facing a Panther or Tiger in a Sherman meant relying not on superior firepower or protection, but on tactics born of desperation. The approved doctrine was swarm tactics. 4 or 5 Shermans would engage a single German heavy tank simultaneously, maneuvering to draw fire while others attempted to flank and hit the thinner side or rear armor. This worked sometimes, but it required the sacrifice of at least 1 or 2 crews to occupy the German gunner's attention while the others closed the distance. Belton Cooper, a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, later described the aftermath of these engagements. He titled his memoir, Death Traps. In it, he documented pulling burned and shattered corpses from destroyed Shermans, sometimes having to hose out the interiors before the tanks could be repaired and sent back into action. He recorded that his division alone lost over 200 tanks in 5 months of combat, not just damaged but completely destroyed. Many were burned so thoroughly that their hulls had to be scrapped. The army tried to close the gap. They upgunned some Shermans with 76mm guns, which offered better armor penetration. This helped against Panthers if you could hit them in the side, but it still couldn't penetrate a King Tiger frontally. They developed HVAP rounds, high-velocity armor-piercing ammunition with tungsten cores, that could defeat Panther frontal armor at ranges up to 1,000 yards. But tungsten was desperately scarce. Most tank companies received allocation of only 2 or 3 HVAP rounds per tank, to be hoarded for the most critical moments. The British had their Firefly, a Sherman mounting the powerful 17-pounder gun, capable of penetrating German heavy armor at reasonable ranges. American commanders requested Fireflies. The British tank factories, already struggling to meet their own needs, eventually agreed to convert 81 Shermans to the Firefly standard for American use. By the time these conversions completed in spring 1945, the situation had changed. Because in January 1945, something new arrived in Europe. They came off the transport ships at the Belgian port of Antwerp on a bitter cold morning in mid-January. 20 tanks, massive and angular, their long 90mm guns jutting forward like lances. The armor was thick, 4 inches of sloped steel on the frontal glacis, giving the equivalent protection of 6 inches of vertical armor. The turret front measured 4.5 inches thick. Low and wide, with a profile more reminiscent of German designs than the tall, boxy Shermans. They were designated T-26E3. Within weeks they would be officially standardized as the M26 and given a name, Pershing, after General John J. Pershing, commander of American forces in World War I. The Pershing had been years in development. Work began back in 1942, when reports from the Eastern Front first revealed the T-34 and KV-1 Soviet tanks that were giving German panzers such trouble. The American response went through numerous prototypes: the T-20 series, the T-23 with electric drive, the T-25 and T-26 programs. Each iteration addressed different problems: gun power, armor protection, mechanical reliability, ease of production. But the development process was plagued by bureaucratic resistance. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, opposed the heavy tank concept. His vision of armored warfare held that American tanks should focus on exploitation and infantry support. Enemy tanks, he argued, should be destroyed by specialized tank destroyers, turreted or casemate-mounted guns on tracked chassis, designed for defensive ambush tactics. Building a heavy tank to fight other tanks was, in McNair's view, a wasteful diversion of resources. McNair's opposition delayed production until December 1943, when General Dwight Eisenhower and General Jacob Devers finally overruled him and authorized manufacture. Even then, production moved slowly. The first prototype didn't begin trials until January 1944. Production of the T-26E3 didn't start until November 1944. By then, American forces had already fought from Normandy to the German border, paying the price in Sherman crews for every mile. The 20 T-26E3 tanks that arrived in Antwerp represented the entirety of Pershing combat deployment until the war's end. They were split between 2 divisions, 10 to Major General Maurice Rose's 3rd Armored Division, and 10 to Major General John Leonard's 9th Armored Division, both part of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army. With the tanks came Major General Gladion Barnes, Chief of the Research and Development Service of Army Ordnance, personally leading something called the Zebra Mission, a technical support team whose job was to keep these experimental tanks running and document their combat performance. The Army's most senior weapons development officer had come to the front lines because these 20 tanks were, in effect, conducting a live-fire test against the German Army. The crews selected to man them were experienced veterans, pulled from combat units that had fought since Normandy. Men like Sergeant Nicholas Mashlanik and Corporal Clarence Smoyer of the 3rd Armored Division. They received abbreviated training, just days to familiarize themselves with controls and systems that differed significantly from the Shermans they had lived in for months. The differences were immediately apparent. The Pershing was heavier, slower to accelerate. Its Ford GAF V8 engine produced between 400 and 450 horsepower. Impressive, but asked to push 46 tons, giving the tank a power-to-weight ratio actually worse than the Shermans. Top speed on roads reached 25 miles per hour, versus the Sherman's 30. Cross-country, the Pershing managed about 10 miles per hour. But it was the gun that mattered. The 90mm M3 gun was 53 calibers long, 4.7 meters from breech to muzzle. It fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at a muzzle velocity of 2,650 feet per second. With standard M82 armor-piercing capped rounds, it could penetrate 7 inches of vertical armor at 1,000 yards. Against sloped armor, the effective penetration decreased, but tests showed it could defeat Panther frontal armor at ranges beyond 1,000 yards. This was revolutionary. For the first time, an American tank could engage German heavy armor on relatively even terms, trading shots at normal combat distances rather than desperately closing to point-blank range. Against the King Tiger, the situation was more complicated. The King Tiger's frontal turret armor measured 7¼ inches thick, sloped at 10 degrees. Its frontal hull glacis measured 5.9 inches at 50 degrees of slope, equivalent to over 8 inches of vertical armor. The standard 90mm M82 round could not reliably penetrate this frontally at combat ranges. However, Army Ordnance had developed something special, the M304 HVP round, designated T30E16 in development. This was a subcaliber tungsten penetrator, flying at 3,350 feet per second. With this ammunition, the 90mm gun could theoretically penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor at ranges approaching 1,000 yards. The problem was availability. Tungsten was so scarce that even with the high-priority Pershings, HVAP ammunition remained rare. Most Pershing crews never received any. Those who did carried only a handful of rounds. But the real question, the one that couldn't be answered in Aberdeen proving ground or on any firing range, was how the Pershing would perform in actual combat, crewed by exhausted men in confused, close-quarters battles where ambush and surprise mattered as much as armor thickness or gun penetration tables. The answer came on February 26, 1945, in a small German town called Elsdorf. The 3rd Armored Division's Combat Command B was pushing toward the Rohr River, part of the larger Operation Grenade offensive designed to close up to the Rhine. Task Force Wellborn, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel John Wellborn, led the advance toward Elsdorf. The Germans had prepared the town for defense. Log roadblocks at every approach, anti-tank guns dug into positions on the outskirts, infantry with Panzerwaffe hidden in the rubble. Spearheading Wellborn's column was Pershing No. 38, nicknamed Fireball. It should have been with Task Force Lovelady, but through some confusion in the motor park, it ended up leading Wellborn's attack instead. The crew commander was Sergeant Nicholas Mashlanik, a veteran tanker who had scored 15 kills since Normandy, 3 of them already in the Pershing. Fireball entered Elsdorf in late afternoon, light fading, shadows lengthening across the destroyed buildings. A fire burned somewhere in the town center, bright flames painting the ruins orange and black. Mashlanik positioned his Pershing to overwatch a roadblock while engineers brought up a bulldozer to clear it. This was the error. Silhouetted by the fire behind him, Fireball became visible to something hidden in the ruins on the far side of the roadblock. A Tiger I heavy tank, 57 tons, its 88mm gun trained on the approaches. The first German shot hit Pershing's turret mantlet, punching through the machine gun port. The armor-piercing round killed both the gunner and loader instantly. The second shot hit the 90mm gun barrel, detonating the round loaded in the chamber, distorting the barrel and rendering the gun useless. The third shot ricocheted off the turret side, wounding the tank commander Mashlanik. Fireball was knocked out. The crew bailed out and survived, testimony to the Pershing's armor protection that absorbed 3 direct hits from a Tiger at point-blank range. In a Sherman, that first shot likely would have penetrated the turret roof or hull, igniting ammunition and killing everyone. But the mission of testing America's new heavy tank had just claimed its first casualty. The wreckage of Fireball sat in Elsdorf for 2 days before recovery crews could extract it. The Army photographed it extensively. Ordnance officers examined the damage, measured penetration angles, and documented exactly how the Tiger's shots had defeated or been defeated by the Pershing's armor. These photographs and reports filtered back through channels, generating new discussions about armor thickness, gun port design and tactical employment. But to the other Pershing crews still fighting toward the Rhine, the message was simpler and more visceral. Even in the Pershing you could die. The new tank wasn't invincible. It could be ambushed, flanked, or destroyed. The advantage it offered was not immortality, just slightly better odds. Over the next weeks, those odds would be tested again and again, in the rubble-choked streets of German cities where the tactical advantages of long guns and thick armor mattered less than quick reflexes and lucky positioning. The question of whether Pershings could defeat King Tigers would become less relevant than a more immediate problem. Could they survive long enough to reach the Rhine? And in the burned-out ruins of Germany in early 1945, survival itself was never guaranteed. The rubble of German cities in early 1945 created a battlefield environment unlike anything American tank doctrine had anticipated. The wide-open tank country of France, where visibility extended to 2,000 yards and beyond, had given way to urban warfare at distances measured in tens of meters. Streets choked with debris. Buildings reduced to precarious walls that could collapse at any moment. Sight lines that extended only to the next intersection. In this environment, the theoretical advantages of the Pershing's thick armor and powerful gun became secondary to more immediate concerns. The ability to traverse a destroyed street without throwing a track, to spot enemy positions before enemy gunners spotted you, to maneuver in spaces barely wide enough for a 46-ton vehicle. The reality of late-war tank combat was not clean, technical exchanges at optimal combat ranges. It was confusion, ambush, and desperate close-quarters action where the first shot determined survival. Clarence Smoyer would discover this on March 6, 1945 in Cologne. By early March, the 3rd Armored Division had fought its way to Germany's 4th-largest city. Cologne straddled the Rhine, the last major natural barrier before the heart of Germany. The western bank of the city had become a priority target for Operation Lumberjack, the First Army's offensive to close up to the Rhine and establish bridgeheads. The German defenders knew what the city's loss would mean. While most Wehrmacht units were retreating toward the Rhine bridges, elements of the 9th Panzer Division, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, and 363rd Volksgrenadier Division had received orders to fight for every block, to delay the American advance as long as possible, to destroy the Rhine bridges before they could be captured. Among the German defenders was at least one Panther medium tank from the 9th Panzer Division. 50 tons, armed with the 75mm KWK-42 gun, capable of penetrating any Allied tank's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. Its crew had positioned it in ambush, hidden from view, covering an intersection near the city center where the Gothic cathedral still stood impossibly intact above the ruins. The Panther's crew had already destroyed 2 American tanks that afternoon. 2 M4 Shermans from Easy Company, 3rd Armored Division, had turned onto the street leading toward the cathedral. The lead Sherman hit a pile of rubble and stopped, calling for a bulldozer. Before the dozer could arrive, the Panther's gunner fired. The 88mm shell, actually 75mm, but American tankers called any German tank gun an 88, penetrated the Sherman's turret. The tank brewed up immediately, flames erupting from the hatches. The second Sherman attempted to reverse. The Panther's second shot disabled its tracks. The crew bailed out before the third shot hit, running for cover as their tank burned behind them. The German crew settled back to wait. Americans were methodical. They would bring up more tanks. The Panther would be ready. What happened next became one of the most famous tank engagements of World War II, largely because Technical Sergeant Jim Bates happened to be there with a camera. Bates was part of the 165th Signal Photo Company, tasked with documenting the advance through Germany. He had been filming B-roll footage near the cathedral when the Shermans were destroyed. Now, as word spread that a Pershing was moving up to engage the German tank, Bates positioned himself with a clear view of the intersection where the burning Shermans still smoldered. The Pershing that arrived was Eagle 7, commanded by Sergeant Robert Early, with Corporal Clarence Smoyer as gunner. The crew had been briefed. German tank in ambush position, exact location unknown, covering the intersection ahead. Their orders were to advance just far enough into the intersection to get a shot at the enemy's flank. Inside the Pershing, the crew understood what this meant. The German gunner would see them the moment they entered his field of fire. He would immediately begin traversing his gun toward them. The question was whether Smoyer could spot the target, aim, and fire before the Panther's gun reached them. Driver Homer Davis eased the Pershing forward. Through his periscope, turned toward the cross street, he could see buildings, rubble, shadows. Then movement, the Panther's turret traversing toward them, the long gun barrel swinging around to point at his face. Davis screamed a warning over the intercom. Bow gunner John DeRiggi saw it too, shouting directions. Smoyer, in the gunner's seat, frantically searched through his sight picture for the target. There, the Panther's hull, partially hidden by debris, but the turret clearly visible, the gun still traversing. The mathematics of survival compressed into seconds. The Panther's power traverse could rotate its turret 360 degrees in approximately 20 seconds. Call it 18 degrees per second. The angle from the Panther's previous target to Eagle 7's position, perhaps 45 degrees. 2.5 seconds of traverse time, maybe 3. Smoyer's hands moved with the muscle memory of 9 months of combat. Traverse the turret. Find the target in the telescope. Adjust for range, Call it 50 meters, close enough that holdover didn't matter. Center mass on the enemy tank's hull. Depress the firing pedal. The 90mm gun fired. The recoil rocked the Pershing backward. The armor-piercing shell crossed the intersection in a fraction of a second and struck the Panther low on the left sponson, penetrating the 2-inch side armor, exploding inside the fighting compartment. The Panther lurched. Its turret stopped traversing. Smoke began pouring from the hatches. Flames appeared seconds later, first wisps, then sheets of fire as ammunition cooked off. The German crew bailed out, stumbling away from their dying tank, hands raised in surrender. The entire engagement lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Jim Bates captured most of it on film. The footage shows Eagle 7 edging into the intersection, the Pershing's long gun trained forward. Then the muzzle flash, the recoil, smoke obscuring the view. When it clears, the Panther is burning. The footage would be shown in newsreels across America, becoming one of the iconic images of American tank power in Europe. What the footage couldn't capture was the reality inside Eagle 7 after that shot. The crew shaking from adrenaline, unable to process how close they had come to being the ones burning. Davis's hands trembling on the controls. Smoyer's voice cracking slightly, reporting target destroyed, over the intercom, trying to sound professional, trying not to think about those 2 or 3 seconds when the Panther's gun was swinging toward them. Years later, historians would analyze that engagement endlessly. They would measure traverse rates, calculate reaction times, debate whether the Panther crew could have fired first if they had been more alert. But for the men in Eagle 7, the lesson was simpler. In close combat, armor and gun power mattered less than who saw who first, who reacted faster, who got lucky. The Pershing had performed exactly as designed. It had survived the approach to contact, gotten into firing position, and destroyed an enemy tank that outweighed it by several tons and mounted a gun theoretically capable of penetrating its armor. But it hadn't done so through overwhelming technical superiority. It had done so because Smoyer was fractionally faster than his opponent, and because the geometry of the intersection gave him a shot at the Panther's vulnerable side armor. Against a King Tiger, the situation would have been different. The Tiger II, Panzer Kampfwagen 6 OSP-B, designated SDKFZ 182, but known universally as the King Tiger or Royal Tiger, represented the ultimate development of German heavy tank design. 70 tons of steel and armor, powered by a 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Its 88mm KWK-43L/71 gun was the most powerful tank weapon deployed by any nation in World War II. Its armor was virtually impenetrable to any Allied tank from the front. The frontal turret face measured 7 1/4 inches thick, sloped at 10 degrees from vertical. The frontal hull glacis measured 5.9 inches at 50 degrees of slope, equivalent protection approaching 9 inches of vertical armor. The side armor was thinner but still substantial, 3.1 inches on the hull sides, 3.3 inches on the turret sides. Tests conducted after the war demonstrated that the British 17-pounder gun, firing APDS discarding sabot ammunition, could theoretically penetrate the King Tiger's turret front at ranges around 1,000 yards. But only under ideal conditions, striking perpendicular to the armor surface. The Soviet IS-2 heavy tank, mounting a 122mm gun, could defeat the frontal armor at ranges of 500 to 600 meters, but only by concentrating multiple shots on the weld seams. The American 90mm M3 gun, firing standard M82 APC-BC ammunition, could not penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor at any range from any frontal angle. This created the situation implied by the title of this video, the notion that Pershing crews faced King Tigers with terror, that desperate long-range gunnery duels occurred at distances of 2,000 yards, that multiple King Tigers fell to American 90mm fire. The reality was far more complex, far more mundane, and in some ways far more interesting than the mythology. Between January and May 1945, the historical record documents only a handful of confirmed engagements between M26 Pershings and Tiger II heavy tanks. The most generous interpretation of available evidence suggests perhaps 3 to 5 actual combat encounters. Several claimed Tiger II kills by Pershing crews were later determined to be misidentifications. Most commonly, Panzer Mark IV tanks with added armor plates that American tankers mistook for the larger Tigers. This was not uncommon. American tank recognition training distinguished German tanks by size and general appearance. Mark III, Mark IV, Mark V, Panther, Mark VI, Tiger. In the confusion of combat, at distance, through periscopes and gun sights, positive identification was difficult. The German tendency to add field modifications and spare track links as applique armor made visual identification even harder. Many American tankers, trained to fear the Tiger above all other threats, reported engaging Tigers when they had actually fought Panzer IVs or Panthers. The actual number of King Tigers deployed to the Western Front was surprisingly small. Only 492 Tiger II tanks were built in total. Of these, the majority served on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, the single largest concentration of German armor on the Western Front, the Wehrmacht deployed 52 King Tigers. By March 1945, when the Pershings were seeing the most combat, perhaps 30 to 40 operational King Tigers remained in the West, spread across multiple fronts from the Netherlands to Bavaria. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Pershing crew's real experience with King Tigers involved not terrifying gunnery duels at extreme range, but rather the practical problems of encountering a disabled or abandoned enemy tank. Fuel shortages meant many King Tigers were destroyed by their own crews when they ran out of gasoline. Mechanical failures immobilized others. The King Tiger's Maybach HL-230 engine, developed for the lighter Panther, was chronically overworked, pushing 70 tons. Final drive failures, transmission problems, and engine breakdowns plagued the type throughout its service. American units frequently encountered abandoned King Tigers. They would photograph them, examine them, sometimes strip them of equipment or use them for target practice with captured ammunition. These encounters generated intelligence reports. King Tiger tank found disabled at map reference. But these were not combat engagements in any meaningful sense. The few actual combat encounters followed a pattern. On April 4, near the Weser River, a modified Pershing called the Super Pershing engaged and destroyed a German armored vehicle at a range of approximately 1,500 yards. The Super Pershing mounted an experimental T-15E 190mm gun, 73 calibers long instead of 53, firing ammunition with a much higher chamber pressure and muzzle velocity of 3,750 feet per second. This weapon could penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The crew reported destroying a Tiger. Post-war analysis by historian Steven Zaloga suggests the target was more likely a Jag Panther tank destroyer or possibly a Panther tank. At 1,500 yards through a gun sight, definitive identification was difficult. The vehicle was destroyed, which was all that mattered tactically. But the historical record remains uncertain about exactly what was destroyed. On April 12, the same Super Pershing crew claimed another German tank destroyed, type unknown. On April 21, they engaged what the commander described as a Tiger II at short range, hitting it in the belly, the thinner lower hull armor, and knocking it out. Zaloga expressed skepticism about this identification, noting that the tactical situation and description better matched a Panzer IV. The standard M26 Pershings, those mounting the regular M390mm gun, likely never destroyed a King Tiger in combat. The mathematics simply didn't favor it. To penetrate the King Tiger's frontal armor, a Pershing would need to use HVAP ammunition, close to within 1,000 yards, and strike an optimal angle. Or it would need to flank the King Tiger and hit the thinner side armor, 3.1 inch, which the standard 90mm round could penetrate at normal combat ranges. But in practice, encounters at ranges where these conditions could be met were extraordinarily rare. The fluid combat of Germany in spring 1945 meant that American and German armor rarely deployed in the kind of open-field, long-range engagements that characterized earlier fighting in France. Instead, combat occurred in towns, in forests, along narrow roads where visibility extended hundreds of yards at most. In these conditions, the Pershing's advantages lay not in superior gun penetration but in superior armor protection and crew survivability. A Pershing could take hits from Panzer IV or Panther guns that would have destroyed a Sherman. It could push through defended towns where lighter tanks would have been knocked out by anti-tank guns or Panzerwaffe. Its psychological effect on German infantry was significant. The arrival of Pershings convinced German defenders that American armor had finally achieved parity with their own heavy tanks. This psychological impact may have been Pershing's greatest contribution to the final campaigns. German infantry who had learned they could stop Shermans with handheld Panzerwaffe became far more cautious when Pershings appeared. German tank commanders who had hunted Shermans with confidence now found themselves facing opponents with comparable protection and firepower. The mythology of Pershing versus King Tiger, of long-range gunnery duels, of American 90mm guns defeating the most heavily armored tanks Germany produced. This mythology served a purpose. It reassured American troops and the public that the technical gap had been closed, that American industry had finally produced a weapon capable of meeting German armor on equal terms. The reality was more nuanced. The Pershing was a capable heavy tank that improved crew survivability and gave American armor units better options against German heavy tanks. But it arrived too late and in too small numbers to fundamentally change the character of armored warfare in Europe. Of approximately 2,000 M26 tanks produced by war's end, only about 200 reached Europe, and perhaps 20 saw sustained combat operations. The war ended on May 8, 1945. By that point, German resistance had collapsed not because of superior Allied tanks, but because of air superiority, artillery supremacy, overwhelming numbers, and the complete breakdown of German logistics and command structures. The Panzer divisions that had terrorized Allied armor in 1944 were gone, destroyed, disbanded, or absorbed into makeshift battle groups with no tanks at all. The title of this video suggests a dramatic confrontation. Panzer crews terrified as Pershings destroyed 12 King Tigers at 2,000 yards. This did not happen. No single engagement, no series of engagements, matches this description. The historical record simply does not support it. What did happen was more subtle and perhaps more significant. The arrival of the Pershing changed the psychological calculus of tank combat. German tankers who had enjoyed technical superiority since Normandy suddenly faced opponents who could trade shots on relatively even terms. The certainty that they could destroy any American tank before it could harm them, that certainty evaporated. For American tank crews, the change was equally profound. Men who had spent months in Shermans, knowing they were overmatched, knowing that facing a Panther or Tiger meant probable death unless they could flank or outnumber the enemy, these men suddenly had a weapon that let them fight back. Not with certainty of victory, not with overwhelming advantage, but with a reasonable chance of survival. The combat record bears this out. In the approximately 3 months of combat operations from February to May 1945, the 20 Pershings that saw action in Europe destroyed approximately 40 German tanks and tank destroyers of all types. They lost approximately 2 or 3 Pershings destroyed by enemy action, with several more disabled by mechanical failures or battlefield damage. Compare this to the Sherman's loss rates, roughly 4 to 5 Shermans lost for every German tank destroyed in the same period, and the Pershing's impact becomes clear. Not overwhelming, not war-winning, but significant enough to matter to the crews inside those tanks. The Super Pershing, that saw combat, the single prototype mounting the longer T-15E1 gun and additional armor plates, demonstrated what American heavy tanks might have achieved if they had entered production earlier. With its increased muzzle velocity and penetration, it could engage any German tank at normal combat ranges with reasonable confidence. But only one reached Europe. Its crew fired the main gun in anger on perhaps 3 occasions. The vehicle was photographed extensively, used for technical intelligence gathering, and eventually scrapped after the war. Orders for 1,000 T-26E4 Super Pershings were placed in March 1945 but reduced to just 25 after Germany's surrender. These vehicles never saw combat. The war ended before they could be deployed. The technical solutions to the problems of 1944 arrived too late to affect the battles that had made them necessary. This pattern, technical solutions arriving after the immediate crisis had passed, characterized much of American armored warfare in World War II. The Army Ground Forces' resistance to heavy tank development, rooted in doctrinal beliefs about the role of armor, meant that American tankers fought with inadequate equipment for much of the war. When adequate equipment finally arrived, victory was already inevitable for other reasons. The men in those tanks, in Shermans and Pershings alike, paid the price for these institutional failures. They fought with what they had, developed tactics to compensate for technical inferiority, and died in numbers that might have been reduced if better equipment had been fielded earlier. The Pershing represented an acknowledgement of these failures. Its development, rushed through in the final year of war, demonstrated that American industry could produce heavy tanks capable of matching German armor. But it also represented an implicit admission. The Sherman, for all its virtues of reliability and producibility, was not sufficient for the armored warfare of 1944 and 1945. After Germany's surrender, the lessons of late-war tank combat influenced American armor development for decades. The M26 served in Korea, where it proved effective against Soviet-built T-34 tanks. It formed the basis for the M46, M47, M48, and eventually M60 Patton series, a lineage of American main battle tanks that served through the Cold War. The 90mm gun family, developed for the Pershing, armed American tanks and tank destroyers for years. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the Pershing remained a symbol of missed opportunities. A weapon that arrived just late enough to prove itself effective but just too late to prevent the deaths of thousands of Sherman crewmen who fought without it. A weapon whose very existence testified to institutional failures that had left American troops overmatched for critical months of combat. The mythology that grew up around the Pershing, stories of long-range Tiger kills, of Panzer crews fleeing in terror, of American technical superiority finally asserting itself, served to obscure these harder truths. It was easier to celebrate the weapon's effectiveness than to question why it hadn't arrived sooner, to focus on its successes rather than contemplate the unnecessary losses that preceded them. The men who crewed the Pershings in combat understood this. They were grateful for their tank's protection, proud of their combat records, aware that they were fortunate to have survived. But they also knew that for every crew that received a Pershing, 4 or 5 crews remained in Shermans, still overmatched, still fighting with inadequate equipment, still dying in numbers that superior tanks might have reduced. Clarence Smoyer, gunner of Eagle 7, lived through the war. He survived Cologne, survived the push to the Rhine, survived the final collapse of German resistance. In his later years he spoke about the Pershing with measured appreciation. It was a good tank, better than the Sherman, capable of handling German armor when handled correctly. But he also spoke about the men who had died in Shermans before the Pershings arrived, the friends who never lived to see the technical gap closed. The Cologne engagement, captured on film, became one of the defining images of the Pershing in combat. Newsreels showed American armor destroying a Panther in the ruins of a German city. The footage was dramatic, compelling, reassuring. What it didn't show were the months of unequal combat that preceded it, the institutional failures that had made such dramatic footage necessary in the first place. This, then, is the answer to the question posed by this video's title. Did Pershings destroy King Tigers at 2,000 yards, striking terror into Panzer crews? No. The historical record does not support this claim. King Tiger encounters were rare, mostly involving disabled or abandoned vehicles, and the few actual combat engagements occurred at much closer ranges against tanks that may not have been Tigers at all. What the Pershing did accomplish was more modest but still significant. It gave American tank crews a fighting chance against German heavy armor. It closed, though did not eliminate, the technical gap that had made armored combat so costly. It demonstrated that American industry, when finally committed, could produce heavy tanks equal to those of any other nation. And it influenced a generation of American tank design, establishing principles of firepower, protection, and mobility that shaped Cold War armor development. But it did not single-handedly win the war. It did not transform the strategic situation. It arrived too late, in too small numbers, to fundamentally alter the course of events that were already flowing inexorably toward Germany's defeat. The war was won by other means: air power, artillery, logistics, industrial capacity, and the blood of millions of soldiers in all theaters. The Pershing was a footnote to that larger story, an important footnote, meaningful to the hundreds of men who crewed them and survived because of their protection, but a footnote nonetheless. The dramatic confrontations of mythology gave way to the mundane realities of mechanized warfare: breakdowns, fuel shortages, traffic jams, and the occasional sharp engagement where training and luck mattered more than armor specifications. In the end, perhaps this is the more valuable lesson. Wars are not won by wonder weapons or technical superiority alone. They are won by competent soldiers making do with imperfect equipment, by logistics networks that keep armies moving, by strategic decisions that create favorable conditions for tactical success. The Pershing was part of this larger system, neither war winner nor failure, but a capable tool employed by skilled men in service of larger strategic objectives. The mythology of the Pershing versus King Tiger, of dramatic long-range duels and terrified German crews, tells us more about what we want war stories to be than about what war actually is. We want decisive weapons, clear victories, moments where technical superiority triumphs. The reality is messier: uncertain identifications at combat ranges, ambushes and accidents, vehicles destroyed by mechanical failure or fuel starvation rather than enemy action. The men who fought in Pershing deserve recognition for their skill and courage. The tank itself deserves acknowledgement as a capable weapon that improved American armored capabilities. But both deserve to be understood in context, neither inflated by mythology nor diminished by revisionism, but assessed soberly based on the historical record. That record shows a weapon that arrived late, fought briefly, and performed adequately. It shows crews who used that weapon effectively within its limitations. And it shows a war that was already ending, decided by factors far larger than any single tank design, no matter how capable. This is the truth that the hyperbolic title obscures but that the historical evidence reveals. Not a story of wonder weapons and terrified enemies, but a more nuanced account of institutional failure, belated correction, and the ordinary courage of men who fought with whatever tools they were given. The Pershing story is not diminished by this truth. If anything, placing it in proper context makes its real accomplishments, modest but meaningful, more worthy of attention than the inflated claims of mythology ever could. The Rhine crossings in March 1945 marked the beginning of the end for organized German resistance in the West. American, British, and Canadian forces poured across the river at multiple points, establishing bridgeheads that expanded into broad penetrations. The German army, already hollowed out by years of attrition on multiple fronts, began to disintegrate. Organized formations broke into scattered battle groups. Tank battalions that had once fielded dozens of panzers were reduced to handfuls. Supply lines collapsed entirely. In this environment, the theoretical advantages of heavy tanks, both German and American, became increasingly irrelevant. The war devolved into a pursuit across Germany, with resistance coming not from concentrated armored formations but from isolated strongpoints, fanatic holdouts, and improvised defensive positions. Tank-on-tank combat, which had defined the narrative of armored warfare since Normandy, became rare and then nearly non-existent. The Pershings that had arrived with such promise in January continued to serve, but their role shifted. They became primarily infantry support vehicles, using their thick armor to absorb fire from anti-tank weapons while advancing through defended towns. Their powerful 90mm guns were used against buildings, strongpoints, and the occasional self-propelled gun or tank destroyer, but not against the German heavy tanks that had justified their development. By April, the tactical situation had changed so completely that additional Pershings arrived in Europe, eventually reaching approximately 200 tanks, and simply joined the advance without encountering the armored opposition they had been designed to defeat. The German Panzer divisions had ceased to exist as effective fighting forces. The Tigers and Panthers that remained were mostly abandoned along roadsides, out of fuel, broken down, or destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The Super Pershing, that single prototype with its powerful T-15E1 gun and additional armor, fired its weapon in combat perhaps 3 or 4 times in total. Its crew took it through the final weeks of the war, encountering abandoned German equipment, surrendering infantry, and the chaotic dissolution of Wehrmacht resistance. The vehicle that had been designed to defeat the King Tiger never definitively engaged one. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe ended. The Pershings that had seen combat were examined, photographed, and studied. Their crews were debriefed. Combat reports were compiled. The Army began the process of determining what lessons could be extracted from the brief combat deployment. The verdict was mixed. The Pershing had demonstrated its capability in the limited engagements it experienced. Its armor protection was superior to the Shermans. Its gun could defeat German heavy armor under the right conditions. Crews reported high confidence in the vehicle. But the chronic mechanical issues that had plagued development persisted: transmission failures, final drive problems, engine overheating. The tank was underpowered for its weight, limiting mobility especially in difficult terrain. More significantly, the Pershing arrived so late that its impact on the war's outcome was negligible. The question that haunted post-war analysis was not whether the Pershing was effective, but why it had taken so long to field. The institutional resistance from Army ground forces, particularly Lieutenant General Leslie McNair's doctrinal opposition to heavy tanks, came under scrutiny. McNair had been killed by friendly fire during Operation Cobra in July 1944. Ironically, just as the inadequacy of the Sherman against German armor was becoming undeniable. His death meant he could not defend his decisions, but his influence lingered in the doctrine and procurement priorities that had delayed the Pershing's development. The debate became public in later years. Belton Cooper's memoir, Death Traps, published in 1998, sparked controversy by arguing that institutional failures had unnecessarily endangered American tank crews. Cooper had served as a maintenance officer with the 3rd Armored Division, responsible for recovering damaged tanks and salvaging what he could from destroyed vehicles. His book documented the horrific casualties suffered by Sherman crews and explicitly blamed the Army's reluctance to field heavier tanks. Other historians pushed back, arguing that Cooper's perspective was limited, that the Sherman's mechanical reliability and ease of production had been essential strategic advantages, that the logistical challenges of deploying heavy tanks earlier in the war would have been insurmountable. The debate continues among military historians, unresolved, representing fundamentally different views about the balance between technical perfection and practical deployability. But for the men who had fought in Shermans and died because their armor could not stop German guns, these academic debates came too late. The statistical record is stark. American armored forces in Northwest Europe from June 1944 to May 1945 lost approximately 4,000 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond repair. The majority were Shermans. Casualty rates for tank crews ran approximately 30% killed or wounded over the course of the campaign, meaning that if you served in a Sherman tank from Normandy to Germany's surrender, you had roughly 1 chance in 3 of being killed or wounded. These numbers become names when you examine unit records. The 3rd Armored Division lost over 160 tanks destroyed in action between Normandy and Germany, with hundreds more damaged. The 4th Armored Division, the 6th Armored Division, every American armored formation paid similar prices. Behind each destroyed tank was a crew: driver, bow gunner, gunner, loader, commander. 5 men whose families received telegrams. 5 men whose lives ended in burning steel compartments, or who survived maimed, or who escaped physically intact but psychologically shattered. The Pershing could not bring these men back. Its belated arrival could not undo the months of unequal combat that preceded it. But it did represent an acknowledgement, institutional if not explicitly stated, that the Sherman had been inadequate against late-war German armor, that American tank crews had been asked to fight with insufficient equipment, that better options could have been fielded sooner. This acknowledgement mattered to the survivors. Men like Clarence Smoyer, who had fought from Normandy to Germany, who had seen friends die in burning Shermans, who had finally received a tank that gave him a fighting chance. These men understood that their survival in the war's final months was partially attributable to the Pershing's protection. But they also understood, with bitter clarity, that earlier deployment could have saved others. Pershing's combat career did not end in Germany. When war erupted in Korea in June 1950, the American military found itself again facing a crisis of tank inadequacy. North Korean forces invaded South Korea equipped with Soviet-built T-34-85 medium tanks, the same vehicles that had terrorized German armor on the Eastern Front. American forces initially in Korea had no tanks at all. The first armor to arrive were M24 Chaffee light tanks, hopelessly outgunned by the T-34s. The Army responded by shipping M26 Pershings to Korea. Some were pulled from active units in Germany, where they had been stationed as part of the occupation force. Others were retrieved from storage or even from museum displays and outdoor monuments. The 8th Army in Korea eventually received approximately 200 M26 tanks, forming the backbone of American armored forces through the first year of the war. In Korea, the Pershing finally fought the war it had been designed for. Against T-34-85s, it was thoroughly effective. The 90mm M3 gun could penetrate the T-34's frontal armor at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, while the Soviet tank's 85mm gun struggled to defeat the Pershing's frontal protection at any but the closest ranges. American Pershing crews reported high confidence when engaging T-34s, a stark contrast to the dread Sherman crews had felt facing Panthers and Tigers. The combat record bore this out. In tank versus tank engagements in Korea from 1950 to 1951, American armor, primarily Pershings and upgunned Shermans, destroyed more than 100 T-34s while losing fewer than 30 tanks to enemy action. The exchange ratio had reversed from the dark days of 1944 in France. But Korea also revealed Pershing's limitations. The mountainous terrain exposed its chronic underpowering. The 4 GAF engine simply lacked the horsepower to push 46 tons up steep grades reliably. The transmission and final drive failures that had plagued the type in Europe continued in Korea. By late 1950, the Army was already withdrawing Pershings from frontline service, replacing them with the improved M46 Patton, which featured a more powerful engine and upgraded transmission. The M46 was essentially an upgraded Pershing, same basic hull and turret, but with a Continental AV-1790 engine producing 810 horsepower instead of the GAF's 450. The difference in performance was dramatic. Where the Pershing had been sluggish and prone to mechanical failure, the M46 was mobile and reliable. It was the tank the Pershing should have been from the beginning. This pattern, of the Pershing representing an adequate but flawed interim solution, defined its legacy. It was neither the disaster some critics claimed nor the war-winning weapon its mythology suggested. It was a capable heavy tank that arrived too late to affect World War II significantly, performed adequately in limited combat, and formed the basis for more successful designs that followed. The technical legacy was substantial. The M26 chassis and turret design influenced American tank development for decades. The M46, M47, M48, and M60 Patton series all trace their lineage to the Pershing. Over 36,000 tanks in this family were eventually built, serving with American forces and allied nations through the Cold War. The basic design principles, powerful gun, thick sloped armor, low profile, established with the Pershing remained relevant through multiple generations of tank development. But the institutional legacy was more complex. The Pershing story became a case study in military procurement, cited in debates about doctrine versus technology, about the risks of institutional conservatism in weapon development, about the balance between deploying adequate equipment immediately and waiting for superior designs. The Army's official histories, written in the decades after World War II, generally supported the decisions that delayed the Pershing. They emphasized the logistical challenges of supporting a heavy tank in Europe, the value of the Sherman's reliability and ease of maintenance, and the need to avoid disrupting production of proven designs. These histories presented the tank procurement decisions as reasonable responses to competing priorities under conditions of uncertainty. Veteran accounts, published in memoirs and oral histories, told a different story. They emphasized the terror of facing German heavy armor and inadequate equipment, the certainty that doctrinal decisions made in safe offices had killed men in combat, the bitter knowledge that better tanks existed but had been withheld for institutional reasons that seemed incomprehensible to those dying. Both perspectives contained truth. The Sherman was easier to produce, maintain and deploy than any heavy tank could have been. Its mechanical reliability meant that Sherman units could sustain higher operational readiness rates than German Panzer units achieved with their technically superior but mechanically complex tanks. The strategic value of deploying large numbers of adequate tanks rather than small numbers of superior tanks was real. But it is also true that individual tank crews would have preferred better protection and firepower even at the cost of lower unit numbers. The man inside the tank measures success by whether he survives the next engagement, not by whether his army's overall tank availability rate meets strategic objectives. From that individual perspective, the delay in fielding the Pershing represented an institutional failure that cost lives. This tension, between strategic necessity and tactical preference, between institutional judgment and individual experience, cannot be fully resolved. It represents fundamentally different perspectives on what constitutes acceptable risk and appropriate resource allocation in warfare. What can be stated with confidence is that the mythology surrounding the Pershing obscures more than it reveals. The dramatic narratives of long-range King Tiger kills, of terrified Panzer crews, of American technical superiority finally asserted. These stories served psychological and political needs in the immediate post-war period, but they do not accurately represent what happened. The actual history is less dramatic but more instructive. A capable tank arrived late, fought briefly against diminishing opposition, performed adequately within its limitations, and influenced subsequent designs. Its combat record was modest. Its technical characteristics were good but not exceptional. Its impact on the war's outcome was minimal. But for the men who crewed them, these abstract assessments meant little. What mattered was that the Pershing gave them better odds of survival than the Sherman had. What mattered was that someone, finally, had acknowledged that American tank crews deserved equipment capable of matching what they faced. Clarence Smoyer returned home after the war. He lived quietly for decades, rarely speaking about his experiences. The footage of Eagle 7 destroying the Panther in Cologne occasionally appeared in documentaries, but Smoyer's role remained largely unknown to the public. It was not until Adam Mako's published Spearhead, in 2018 that Smoyer's story received wide attention. In 2019, at age 96, Smoyer finally received formal recognition. The Army awarded him and his crew the Bronze Star for their actions in Cologne, 74 years after the engagement. The ceremony acknowledged not just their individual courage but the broader contribution of the tankers who had fought in Europe's final campaign. Smoyer's comments at the ceremony were characteristically modest. He praised his crew, credited their survival to luck as much as skill, and remembered the men who had not come home. When asked about the Pershing, he said simply that it was a good tank and he had been fortunate to have one. He did not claim extraordinary feats or dramatic victories. He spoke of doing his job under difficult circumstances, of trying to survive, of hoping the war would end before his luck ran out. This perspective, humble, factual, focused on survival rather than glory, represents the reality of armored combat more accurately than any amount of dramatic mythology. Tank warfare in World War II was not a series of dramatic duels between technical marvels. It was confusion, fear, mechanical failure, and brief moments of terror when enemy fire sought your position. It was the grinding anxiety of advancing through terrain where every treeline might hide an anti-tank gun, where every building might conceal a Panzerwaffe team. The Pershing reduced some of that anxiety. Its thicker armor meant that anti-tank weapons that would have penetrated a Sherman might be deflected. Its powerful gun meant that targets requiring multiple Sherman rounds could be destroyed with a single shot. These improvements were meaningful to the men inside the tanks, even if they did not fundamentally alter strategic outcomes. In the end, the story of the Pershing is not about wonder weapons or dramatic victories. It is about institutional decisions and their human cost. It is about the gap between what soldiers needed and what institutions provided. It is about how long it took for technical solutions to reach the men who needed them, and what that delay meant in human terms. The hyperbolic title that began this video promised a story of Panzer crews terrified by Pershings destroying King Tigers at long range. That story does not exist in the historical record. What exists instead is more complex, more ambiguous, and perhaps more valuable as a lesson about the realities of warfare and military procurement. The Pershing arrived too late to save the thousands of American tankers who died in Shermans. It fought too briefly to accumulate a decisive combat record. It faced too little opposition to prove its full capabilities. But it did demonstrate that American industry, when finally committed, could produce heavy tanks equal to those of any other nation. And it did give the men who crewed it a better chance of survival. That is the real story. Not the dramatic mythology of long-range gunnery duels, but the more modest truth of a capable weapon belatedly provided to soldiers who had needed it months earlier. The cost of that delay, measured in lives and unnecessary casualties, in months of fighting with inadequate equipment, represents the true legacy of Pershing's story. It is a legacy that should prompt reflection on how military institutions make decisions about equipment and doctrine, about when conservatism becomes negligence, about whose perspectives matter when evaluating competing priorities. These questions remain relevant. They will face future generations of military leaders making decisions about weapon systems, deployment schedules, and the balance between proven designs and technical innovation. The men who fought in World War II cannot answer these questions for us. But their experience, documented in combat reports, preserved in veterans' accounts, recorded in the official histories, provides evidence that should inform our judgment. The Pershing story is part of that evidence, a reminder that institutional decisions have human consequences, that delays in providing adequate equipment cost lives, that mythology serves present needs but history demands accuracy. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.